What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 191, and I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I have Hunter DeRensis joining me. He's my colleague at the Libertarian Institute. He's the editor of that site and the communications director for BringOurTroopsHome.us, one of the most important projects going on right now, attempting to rein in the U.S. war state. So we'll be talking about his work there and the actions that they have going on. And also, he has a great new article out at the American Conservative on the military-industrial complex, and we'll be discussing that as well. So follow all the work that me and Hunter put out by checking out the Libertarian Institute. You can specifically support this show just by liking, sharing, and recommending the show. Things you do just by clicking your finger. So YouTube, Odysee, and Rumble for the video version. We post on Facebook and Twitter for social media. And then you can also support the show directly by donating at Patreon or Subscribestar. And then we also have crypto information, and all that can be found in the show notes page. So check that out. The last way you can help the show, and this way you get to help yourself out too by getting a great discount on your CBD products, is by doing your CBD shopping at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Paloma Verde is a great small business, a libertarian family-run company. I highly recommend it. They have the lab test results for their products right there on the homepage, so you know you're getting the absolute top-of-the-line CBD. They have all kinds of different products. They mix it with melatonin or curcumin. If you want like a low dose of CBD, their gummies are absolutely fantastic. Take a little bit of edge off throughout the day. Maybe a higher dose soft gel if you're trying to get to sleep at night. I really like their topicals. I think they do a fantastic job of relieving muscle pain. Wherever you got going on, there's probably something at Paloma Verde that could help you. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. And the best part is when you use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, you get a discount and the show gets a kickback. So great way to support the show, great way to help yourself out. And now let's get into an interview with Hunter DeRensis. Hey Hunter, how's it going? Welcome to Conflicts of Interest.
Hey, Kyle. Really happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. You are my coworker at the Libertarian Institute, and you have recently done some appearances on like the Scott Horton Show and Pat Show from the Institute, and they've been talking about your fantastic article on the military-industrial complex at the American Conservative titled Merchants of Death. And we'll certainly talk about that today, and I'll tell everybody why it's one of my favorite articles on the military-industrial complex. But let's start out with your work at BringOurTroopsHome.us. This is really one of the like most important projects going on, and yeah, just like BringOurTroopsHome.us is the URL of the organization. And Hunter, tell I guess a little bit about what your role is and what the overall goal of the organization is.
So you're right. When I'm not the editor at the Libertarian Institute, I'm the communications director at Bring Our Troops Home, and they can check out the URL, as you just said, BringOurTroopsHome.us. We have a lot of resources on that page. We are a veterans advocacy organization that is always looking out for the interests of U.S. veterans and active duty soldiers, and basically demanding that the U.S. government, the federal government, follow the prescripts of the U.S. Constitution, enforce Article 1, Section 8 that says only Congress can declare war, and that we should be following the humble constitutional foreign policy befitting a limited government republic that was envisioned by our founding fathers. The organization was founded in January 2019 by my boss, Sergeant Dan Knight. Dan joined the Marine Corps fresh out of high school back in the early 90s. He was in there for a short time until President Bill Clinton, due to some military reforms, decided to cut the size of the Marine Corps. So Dan was transferred over to the U.S. Army. He served there for a time, retired, and then after 9/11 rejoined the service and joined the Idaho National Guard, where he was deployed to Afghanistan 18 months from 2005 to 2007. And Dan has always been a very strong, rock-ribbed constitutional conservative who believes in our founding ideals, believes in liberty, and believes that our foreign policy, the 20 years of endless war and undeclared war that we have suffered in the Middle East, is a travesty both to the people who live there, to the soldiers who fight these wars, and to our freedoms here at home. And he speaks for our organization when he says that we need to bring our troops home, enforce the U.S. Constitution, and get back to the way things should be before we had this all-powerful executive where a single man, the U.S. president, believes that he can send our men and women in uniform off to these wars that are not overseen by Congress, that are undeclared, not voted on, no responsibility taken for however much money, for however length of time, and for whatever cost.
Yeah.
And so I think I agree. It's an important organization. You don't see very many organizations trying to do what we do because we have a very interesting take on it. You see, the organizations you do see, which I will say do good work, they're good people, but they focus so much on Washington, D.C. When you talk about war powers, they view it as lobbying people on Capitol Hill to suddenly reclaim the authority that Congress abandoned 70 years ago and has shown no interest in reclaiming since. There's a reason that Congress did not stand up during Korea or Vietnam or at the beginning of the global war on terror to say, well, shouldn't we be the ones who are deciding when to go to war? I think you will agree, and most of your listeners will agree, that there's no solutions that are going to come out of Washington, D.C. The swamp is not going to fix itself. And I think it's a bit of wasted resources and a bit naive to think that we are going to win these battles by playing on the war party's turf. That's why Bring Our Troops Home takes the fight to your communities, your locales, your neighborhoods. We take the fight directly to state houses and we lobby state representatives, state senators to say, you have the authority under the 10th Amendment and under the U.S. Constitution to say that your National Guard units, the National Guard units of Idaho, of Florida, of Oklahoma, of Ohio, of all these separate states, they should not be deployed into active combat unless there is a formal declaration of war by the U.S. Congress as stated explicitly in the U.S. Constitution. This doesn't include training exercises. This doesn't include going to other states for relief efforts like hurricanes or wildfires. It merely says you cannot send our soldiers, our men and women who join the National Guard to aid their neighbors, you can't send them to Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or these other places until Congress sits down, debates, and votes to declare war, because that is the legal way, and it's the only way recognized by the U.S. Constitution. So to achieve that, we work on Defend the Guard legislation. These are bills that explicitly prohibit the deployment of a state's National Guard without a declaration of war. And despite only being founded now going on 3 years ago, our organization has seen immense success with this. Just the past year, we had legislators agree to be sponsors of this bill in 31 states, which for any activists who are listening or anyone who gets involved in their local politics knows is an incredible achievement that it's extremely difficult to come by. But I think it says something that we're a small organization. It's just me, Dan, and my coworker, Diego Rivera, that three people who care about this issue can get this kind of attention because the American people, when you tell them these issues, when you say veterans want to bring our troops home, when you tell them the government is not following the Constitution, when you tell them that there's no oversight for these wars where your sons and daughters are being sent, they listen. And we've been able to find all of these state legislators who care about liberty and who are willing to take a stand on the issue because they're not in Washington, D.C. The military-industrial complex is not going out and buying all these local politicians like they are with Capitol Hill. There's so much more ground that is untread in these state houses that are open to real political success. And that's what I think we're so excited about, because we're getting ready for the 2022 legislative session. We're getting ramped up. Our goal is to have legislation sponsored in all 50 states. And we're on the road. I was just getting texts from Diego today saying, hey, this state, I found somebody, they're in. We got this. We're close to hitting our 40-state benchmark. The goal is 50 by the end of next year. So things are going well. And I think you can bet to see a lot of Defend the Guard in the news over the next 12 months, which we're extremely excited by, because I truly believe this is the best way to end our wars. This is how we're going to do it.
Yeah. So there's one thing that I really like about this, and that is, as you point out, you're not taking it to DC, and that's in a way because I think it, as you point out, is futile. Like maybe they'll do things like if you get a lot of pressure on them in DC, they will pass a war powers resolution and let the president veto it. They will repeal the 2002 authorization for use of military force, but not touch the 2001. And I feel like you're playing with fire a little bit there because, you know, we talk about repealing the 2001 AUMF, and then you have somebody like Tim Kaine, who's the senator who actually has the power, and he goes, did I hear repeal and replace? And so now you're going to have a 2021 AUMF, and that's not better. I don't care what like they write in it, it's not going to help the situation. It's just going to reauthorize more warfare, where this is I think more focused, right? Like there's no wiggle room in bring our troops home.us. Like maybe it would pressure Congress to actually pass a act of war, but that, I mean, that hasn't been done since what, the 1930s, so it's not going to happen. Right? It's been World War II since they actually passed that. And if I understand it correct, Defend the Guard, that legislation specifically prohibits AUMFs from being used as a pretext to send the National Guard overseas, correct?
Yes, it explicitly says you need a declaration of war by Congress, which is inherently specific. It lists who we're going to war with. It gives a general timetable, a general sense of an end date, just like it was for our entire history until after World War II. And I think it's a problem where a lot of the organizations who do work out of Washington, D.C., they do see AUMFs as, well, that's just how modern war is done. And they want to limit it in some sense. But at the end of the day, AUMFs are inherently unconstitutional. And that's the official stance of our organization, because it is not constitutional for one branch of government to give over its duly inherited powers over to another branch of government. Congress cannot simply pass a law that says, well, now the president makes law. That'd be unconstitutional. For the same reason, an AUMF is an authorization to use force. It's Congress saying we are deferring decision making to the president. When Congress passed the 2002 authorization for use of force against Iraq, they weren't saying we're going to war with Iraq or we have to. We're saying it's now George W. Bush's decision. And in March 2003, if George Bush and Dick Cheney sat down and said, well, never mind, they wouldn't have invaded. And Congress, despite passing the OMF, no war would have happened because it's out of their control. And I don't think you can take something as fundamental as war powers that, again, are explicitly written into the Constitution. There's no interpretation here. It's something that Congress cannot just give away. And an AUMF, especially one as open-ended as we're seeing, should not be recognized. And I think you really hit the nail on the head with the talk of repeal and replace, where it says, I completely agree. 2021 AUMF is not going to actually do anything to benefit our foreign policy. And any kind of language they try to include, restrict the executive branch, I simply have no faith in, because the executive branch is very good lawyers and they will find ways around it, just like they have throughout all of U.S. history to grow government. Whereas Defend the Guard is an actual mechanism where you have state government denying power to the federal government, and you have a real way of stopping federal encroachment onto state authority. And that's what I think the brilliance of it is, because you will have the states actually saying no to the president, whereas Congress, we've seen, are not going to do that. And my biggest problem, I'll just add this on, my biggest problem with the advocates of repealing the 1991 AUMF against Iraq and the 2002 authorization for use of force against Iraq, one of their primary arguments for why we can take them off the books is, well, this will have no effect on current military campaigns. Then why bother? What are we doing? I'd love to see these taken off the books, but frankly, why is the anti-war movement and the pro-constitution movement wasting our very limited resources on these campaigns that are not going to have any effect on the wars we're currently fighting. If we repeal the 2002 AMF, is that going to take the 2,500 troops that are in Iraq out of there? What about the 1,000 in Syria that Congress never authorized? What about our involvement in Yemen or the troops we're now deploying back into Somalia? I'm looking for effective answers, and my organization, not my organization, but the organization I'm a part of, BringOurTroopsHome.us, is looking for effective answers. And that's why I'm a believer in Defend the Guard, because it's actually going to make positive change. It's not just a moral victory, it's a true political victory, and that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah. So another thing I really like about the organization is it's a veterans organization that is not pro-war, but is proudly veteran and proudly American, which I think is important because it gives, as Scott Horton would always say, if you like your identity, you could keep it option for a lot of veterans. And in the past, I think it felt like, while, the veterans groups that are anti-war are absolutely fantastic, they're also pro-Medicaid, Medicare for all and stuff like this, which for a lot of people is a red line. Like, they're just not going to support that kind of, government level of spending and welfare programs. And honestly, that being that far to, whatever the left means, the left, right? And so with the Bring Our Troops Home, I don't know if you guys are like explicitly right, but Damn It Night is like a very proud American, and I think that's a really important identity for a group like this to have in that way, especially when you're going to like Republican legislators. I think you went to Montana, you have Damn It Night. I think you also got like Scott Horton up there to speak too, and I mean, this is like really important stuff that's going on. And while maybe the state legislator in Montana doesn't have quite as much power or authority as the Congress, you're more likely to move them, I think.
Yes, we are an organization geared towards veterans and to represent veterans. To clarify for the audience, I am the only person involved with the organization who is not a veteran. I have not served, but I simply am the civilian trying to help my friends out. As I said, Dan served in Afghanistan, and my other coworker, Diego Rivera, served in Iraq as a U.S. Army Ranger. So they've both served. Many of the people that we work with have served. Many of the legislators that we seek out to introduce the Guard bills are veterans themselves. And I think it's so interesting how underreported it is that veterans, by higher numbers, support withdrawals from Iraq, from Syria, supported it from Afghanistan. When you take these polls, you'll find that a majority of Republicans support these withdrawals. Even stronger majority of Democrats do at the moment. And veterans break records for either party consistently going back years now. Over 65%, a supermajority, 2/3 of U.S. military veterans say we need to get out of these endless wars in the Middle East. Now, why is that? It's because these guys have been on the ground. They've seen that these wars are not benefiting the American people, that they are not making their neighbors safer or freer or richer or really helping at all. And it's their experiences that help mold that opinion. And that's why we're so lucky to work with veterans like that, who are willing to take a stand and say that they are proud to be an American, they are proud of their service, but that these wars don't benefit anyone, especially the soldiers fighting them. And I think that's such an important thing to say. And I agree. We are a very proudly American organization. We are pro-America, pro-Constitution, and pro-veteran. If some people interpret that as conservative, they are welcome to. We are very strong about not taking political stances on anything except war and peace and congressional war powers. But I will say that we are very proudly in the tradition of the old right. And you can, if you go to our social media, you can see a lot of images where we use these inspiration from actually some of the people that I talk on the article in the American Conservative, where we do point ourselves on the shoulders of people like William Borah, who Dan McKnight is the biggest fan of, I will say, that we stand with Robert LaFollette Jr., Young Bob, who actually had one of my favorite quotes that we used in our media campaign. I believe it was at the end of 1941, where young Bob LaFollette, who was a senator from Wisconsin, a Republican, said that we have only two planks in our platform, the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Our motto, I am an American. And I think that just perfectly sums up our organization and what we believe and where we stand on these issues.
Yeah. So getting back to the, state level versus federal level thing, I guess maybe one critique that I could imagine somebody having is they say, Hunter, like you do all this work and congratulations, you passed Defend the Guard in like 3 states. And one of those states, the bill ended up having like the teeth stripped out of it. So not really. So like, New Hampshire and Montana, they're national guards. You had to have a declaration of war. But, so what? Those are kind of like rural, low population states. Does that really do anything? I just think that, and that's why maybe people want to focus on the national level, because if you do get them to do it right, you could end the wars tomorrow, in, I guess, an ideological fantasy world kind of sense.
Certainly. I think people are lacking a little imagination if they are thinking about that scenario and maybe are not fully understanding the structures of our military. The fact is that over 40% of the U.S. troops that have been deployed in the global war on terror have been National Guardsmen. The National Guard forms the backbone of our entire military. They are units that are currently fully integrated into the U.S. military apparatus. And while you might hear about SEAL Team 6 and these other, very elite units, it's really these National Guardsmen, these local moms and dads, business owners, church goers, regular people, your neighbors, who form the backbone of the U.S. military and are in these units that get deployed to fight our wars and support the military when they're overseas. And I think when you have even a handful of states, you just named two. So let's say just 2 states pass Defend the Guard and are willing to enforce it to say, until there is an official declaration of war by Congress, our National Guard units will not be going into these overseas active duty combat missions. I think you would see an immediate domino effect, especially with the politics of it, where these states are increasingly, we've seen over the past year, more willing to stand up for themselves and the interests of their citizens if they feel oppressed or opposed by the federal government in Washington, D.C. And I think it would not take very many states before the government would say, we are losing a lot of our manpower, we are losing our resources, we physically and literally cannot keep up our current undeclared and illegal military campaigns. We either actually have to get Congress to make these deployments constitutional, or we have to bring our troops home because it's not a sustainable effort. And so that's the choice we present to the federal government. We're not an explicitly anti-war organization in the sense we think war is wrong in all cases. I know for a fact Dan and Diego, if this country was ever threatened, would stand up, rejoin the military, and be on the front lines, because that's the kind of people they are, and that's the kind of people we work with. And if a war is constitutionally declared by Congress, then it's legal and we would be willing to fight it. But at the end of the day, we just not have seen that bravery from Congress. You see immense more bravery from our men and women in uniform who are willing to put their lives on the line, rather than these members of Congress, these elected bureaucrats who go and are not even willing to sign their names down to a vote because they don't want to be held responsible for anything that happens. So I think it's just putting the ball in the government's court to demand either do your job or bring our troops home. These are the options on the table, and it's non-negotiable, frankly.
Yeah. And, there are a couple issues with it, too, where, this isn't what people were signing up for when they signed up for the National Guard. I forget what the commercial was when we were kids, Hunter, but it was like, 2 weeks a year, 2 weekends a month, or 2 weekends. I forget what it was, but it was basically like, you join the National Guard. We'll train you a couple times. If a flood comes to your town or something like that, you guys will be the ones out there doing it, but you're not going to be separated from your family for 9 months to go to Iraq and get killed in a war. That's not what the National Guard is. And so I feel like, you kind of selling something false, and in a way that this would be kind of protecting the interest of the state's constituents, right, and the rights of their civilians, and they were lied to by the Congress. But also they're supposed to have these kind of people around to be able to come in an emergency. And so, for example, when Katrina hits New Orleans or there's a forest fire in Oregon, there should be National Guard there to help. And in at least those two cases, there weren't, because they were fighting undeclared unconstitutional wars. I'm just wondering if that resonates at all with the state level, because it seems like one of those things where I say it and I think everybody's just going to agree with me and be absolutely outraged and be like, yeah, that's really messed up. Our forests are burning down and they have our troops over in Afghanistan. But then people kind of just are like, yeah, okay.
I think you hit the nail on the head with the reasons people join the National Guard. It's because they care about their communities, they care about their neighborhoods, and when there's trouble, like a natural disaster or like even the pandemic, as we're seeing, where they're willing to sign up and donate part of their time for this public service because they do care. And it's not because they have an interest to deploy overseas for these long-term deployments to either nation build or be shot at by people halfway around the world who really have, just it does not benefit their family or the people that they originally signed up to help. And I think it is an excellent point that we bring up with that, and we do get a positive response when we make that point to people. And it's actually something that Dan loves to tell the story. I'll give a shortened version of it, but he often talks about how during Hurricane Katrina, the Louisiana National Guard was deployed to Iraq. They weren't present. And the Louisiana National Guard is specifically a unit of engineers who are experts at building dams and levees and all of these other things that are crucial for the infrastructure for the state of Louisiana. But they were deployed to Iraq, building dams and levees for a corrupt Iraqi government. And it was Dan, who was in the Idaho National Guard, who led a convoy of guardsmen driving down from Idaho to Louisiana to offer assistance right before his deployment to Afghanistan. So that's what happens when we send our units overseas, and we find ourselves woefully unprepared because now we lack this infrastructure to actually take care of our own people or solve our own problems. Because you have politicians in D.C. who view the world as America's backyard. And I adore Bill Kaufman's quote, one of my favorite writers, where he said, you can either care about Baghdad or your own backyard, but you can't care about both. Because the fact is, every dollar spent in our wars overseas, every soldier deployed overseas who doesn't see their family for 9 months or longer, or who, God forbid, never comes back at all, that is a travesty for the American people, and that is a loss we need to recognize and avoid at all costs.
Okay. So the last thing I think I had on this I wanted to ask you is, I know Defend the Guard I think is just like mainly National Guard, but I've been seeing more and more in the news that the Coast Guard is being deployed to like the South China Sea, the Philippines, and Taiwan. And do you think there would be any interest maybe in rolling this into like a larger and have like the Coast Guard maybe more? But I don't know if the states have control of the Coast Guard like they do the National Guard, or how that all works. But I was just curious if that was something you guys look into.
My understanding is that the Coast Guard is a branch of the military, just like the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Army, etc., and that they would not come under state authority. Although I don't know the exact details of how much or where the oversight is. For instance, if the Coast Guard is just off the coast of Maine, is it primarily people in Maine who are monitoring that, or is it people in the national military structure? I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Hunter. Anyways, we should talk about your article here. And for, people who listen to this show, you've probably read and know a lot about the military-industrial complex and everything like that. But your article, Hunter, takes it from an angle and from a starting point that's so much earlier than most people do, going back to World War One. And so many times I feel like articles about the military-industrial complex start with Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address saying, warning about the military-industrial complex. And as far as I could tell, and how it seems to me, by the time that Dwight D. Eisenhower says that, it's already done. That's like, Trump on his way out warning about the deep state. It's already there. They already have control of everything. This is absolutely, crazy that people like kind of set that as the date of the start of the military industrial complex when, that's well past the time you could get them out of power. So, where do you kind of go back and start your article here on the military industrial complex and why?
I think you're completely correct. In his farewell address, Dwight D. Eisenhower was not having some premonition of the future, warning that in a couple decades you guys might have this problem. Ike was diagnosing a problem that had already existed for decades, and by the time he became president, was already becoming cemented. It was that sort of diagnosis. So yes, I take my article even farther back to a century ago during World War One, where you see for the one of the first times in American history, broad public criticism of arms manufacturers, military contractors, and the businessmen who are making large profits off of U.S. war and the deaths of U.S. soldiers. And what I really tried to catalog in this article was not necessarily a history of the military industrial complex itself, but a history of the public perception of the military industrial complex, because I was fascinated by how we go from an era during World War One and just afterwards during the interwar period, where you have broad and accepted public outrage about the issue, saying that these companies are pernicious influence on our politics, that these businessmen are making unjust profits off the backs of this government policy, and that it's something people should care about and that we should do something about. And fast forward a couple decades during the Cold War and even now during the global war on terror, when it's an issue that goes unsaid. Even today, and I mentioned this later on in the article, today you have the American people get asked by pollsters, well, should the military budget increase or decrease? Or even you'll have sometimes they'll be asked about selling weapons to a particular country or a particular arms deal. But you never get pollsters never ask voters, do you think that these companies like Northrop Grumman, like Lockheed Martin, like Raytheon, should they be making these extravagant profits off the deaths of U.S. soldiers, or them seeing their entire profit motive off the backs of government contracts? Is this a just system, and do you think we should do something about it? The American people are never asked that. There's no polling on this. Whereas 80 years ago, there was. It was common, and people had something to say about that. And I wanted, with this article, to sort of give readers an idea of why that change happened and maybe what we can do about it today to fix it.
Yeah, so that was kind of the part I wanted to get to with you because if people want to, I really recommend the interview you did with Patrick McFarlane on Liberty Weekly, where you do and go through a lot of the history. But what are some of like kind of the current things that could be done about the military industrial complex? Because I mean, at this point, the amount of money that the U.S. government gives to like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon every year is comparable to like cabinet level departments of the United States. With this amount of money, the federal government could indoctrinate our children. What do you think Lockheed Martin could do with that amount of money? And they have been, indoctrinating you by, buying up all this media and, the think tanks and stuff like that. So what you got, Hunter?
I think the answer depends on how radical you want to get with the solution. I think there's a lot of people working in DC, a lot of good people, many of whom I interviewed for this piece, who have suggestions about what we can do about military contractors taking advantage of this process. And that can start with, first of all, just transparency. Let's get a better idea of where these numbers are coming from. Let's open their books and just get an idea of what's going on. And that there's also similar reforms to something I talk about closer to the middle of the piece, where during World War II, we had a process where military contractors would essentially come to the government and say, we can build this weapon system for you or build these tanks or what have you, for this amount of money and this amount of time, and we'll be getting this profit margin. Well, after a year where the things are built, let's say they went, as they often do, over budget and over time, the government, through a renegotiation process, can say, well, we're not going to pay you all of this, or you said you were getting 11% profit margin on this, but at the end of the day, you're 32% profit margin. We're going to now retroactively renegotiate the deal so it's closer to the original paradigms. And that process was thrown out during the 1970s, but I think you could see that make a comeback without too much of a problem in DC. I mean, the truth is, any reform towards these companies or any kind of sign that you're going to try to tip over their gravy boat is going to lead to a real hellstorm of criticism by them, by their lobbyists, by their media cronies. But I think that's a pretty moderate solution in my mind, saying as a radical. But if you really want to go for the more radical solutions, I think you go back to what Gerald Nye and his colleagues were proposing in the 1930s. And that was, for example, more U.S. Navy ships to be built in government shipyards where there's not a private company making a profit off of these contracts. So today that would be like the U.S. government manufacturing and procuring its own weapons instead of purchasing them from these private firms. Or it could also be the incentive on what profits they can make during wartime. Gerald Nye proposed that when the U.S. formally goes to war, tax rates on individuals making under $10,000 should automatically be doubled. And that's $10,000 in 1935 money, not today. I'm not sure what the transfer rate of that is. But he suggested that anyone making over $10,000 in that period should begin paying a tax rate of 98%. He said, once we start doing this, watch how many jingoists or war hawks there really are when it hits them where they really care about, their pocketbook. And I love a line I include in the piece talking about The Nation magazine. When they heard this proposal, they said if it was ever enacted, we'd suddenly see big businessmen become our biggest peace advocates, which I just find very amusing. But I nothing that extreme that really harms, the average person. But I think it would not be unlibertarian to say that when we at war and you have these firms that are ostensibly private but make 90% of their income through government contracting and through this corrupt system, I don't think as libertarians or as capitalists we should treat them as private firms. I think the only appropriate way is to view them as simply another arm regime, something that would not exist without the warfare state we currently live under. And I don't think it's unlibertarian to say that, we're at war in Iraq for whatever circumstance. Lockheed Martin, as long as you're making weapons for us, you can do at a 5% profit margin, but the government is going to make sure or seize all of these other assets. Because it's frankly immoral that you're making a profit off the backs of the deaths of U.S. soldiers. That's an opinion I adhere to, and I'm sure there'd be a good libertarian debate on that. But I feel very comfortable that sort of solution, direct tax on these companies, is neither anti-capitalist, anti-free market, or unlibertarian in any way.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you on that. For essentially any company that has their entire budget subsidized by the U.S. government, just essentially the entire elite and ruling and wealthy class in the United States today leeches so much off of the federal government that while we do have the overview of capitalism and private ownership in the United States. There's a lot of, privatizing of the profits, and then everything else is really, the R&D, all the research and development, all of the funding for this stuff all comes from the state. And so, and any kind of losses, right? Like, how many of these companies were the ones that got bailouts from the US government during the COVID pandemic when they didn't even need it? The pandemic really didn't hit the military's bottom line. They kept up with all the same military drills and everything they were doing. They're actually planning a bigger budget this next year. When everybody else has been asked to cut back, the military gets to expand even more. I guess, one of the things I kind of got to the feeling at the end of this article, Hunter, was pessimistic, I guess, because they've had so much time and they have built so much influence. And at the time, when maybe something could have been done when it was smaller, I mean, they were able to run roughshod and just kind of take out the Nye committee, right? Not exactly, but they were eventually able to water it down, whittle it down, and then move it along and get rid of it. I think that was ultimately Truman's role, right? So I don't know. Do you have any hope, like in something like a Nye committee today, where if we sat down and like people looked at the butts of Lockheed Martin, if people would care, if that would make any dent in this, or if you really think the way to go is looking at really reining in these companies in some way, either if it's by essentially making it so that you can't profit off of making military products, like you just can't do it. Like it creates way too much of a what's it called? Not a conflict of interest, but also just like a moral hazard, right? You can't have people who make money off of killing. I don't know. What you got?
I completely understand the pessimism. I think it's hard not to be a bit pessimistic when we see how strong the military industrial complex is today. And I reference near the end of the article a diagnosis presented by two political theorists back in, I believe, 1971, where they put forward the thesis that the United States does not so much have a military industrial complex as much as the US economy is a military industrial complex, where so many firms benefit from government largesse. There's so much profits to be made by these companies that are not fulfilling consumer needs or not working off a profit and loss system, which we want to see in a marketplace, but are simply getting their pockets lined by taxpayer money and by these crony contracts. It's too large, it's too influential. You're not trying to excise part of the system, you're challenging the system itself. I can completely understand that, and I think logically it's hard to argue against it. But at the end of the day, Kyle, I do think we need to try to be happy warriors and look at the potential, which, as I discussed earlier in the interview, it's true that the American people, the modern American people, have not been asked about these issues. How often is the average voter, Democrat or Republican, asked about, what do you think of Lockheed Martin making all this money during the war? And they'll give you a confused look and say, wait, what do you mean? How much money are you making? What do you mean we're going to war? Thousands of our soldiers are dying, and they're getting billions of dollars for these weapons that don't work half the time. I think if you really presented that case to the American people, you would see a groundswell of support for a reform of our current system. And that's what I try to be hopeful about, because I think it involves people like us getting the message out. It involves politicians like Joe Kent, who's running for Congress in Washington, who I interviewed for the piece, making the case about the military-industrial complex and calling it out for what it is, because it's a term that is so rarely used. It was huge press when Donald Trump used it, I believe, 2 years ago when he referred to a military-industrial complex. And that's the same Donald Trump who helped sign all of these weapons deals with foreign countries. So he's no threat to them. It was simply bombastic news that he even used the term, because that's how hard it is to get into discussions these days. So I don't think it's a matter of the American people have seen our system and accepted it. I think they've never really been asked. And I think it's the job of people like us to ask those questions, to get the word out. And I believe truly in my heart, if you were to make this case to the American people at large, I think we'd be pleasantly surprised by their reaction and how much the average person in this country agrees with our point of view about what I think we should start calling them, merchants of death. And that's one of the points I try to do in the article, that we need to bring back the term. Don't simply treat Northrop Grumman like it's like Walmart. Oh, it's just another big corporation. No, it's not. These are people who are making large profits and enriching themselves off the backs of not only the U.S. taxpayer, but our soldiers who are fighting and dying in these wars. And they're using their influence in government to lobby for these wars. So I think we can only call them what they are, the merchants of death. And we should treat them as such.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they're not the old, it's a private company, bro, is still what you'll get from some libertarians, even on this issue. And it's just not the case. These aren't private companies. Hunter, I think that's a great place to wrap up. You leave it on a somewhat positive note. And I will say, I think that, the work you're doing with Bring Our Troops Home and that organization, it could be one that starts to get this message in front of the American people. It's such an uphill battle because I just was reading The Hill yesterday, and their national security newsletter is sponsored by Boeing. They actually have in the headline for their national security newsletter, presented by Boeing, right in the middle of it. The political newsletter is sponsored by Lockheed Martin. I'm not quite sure who sponsors the other mainstream media outlets, but Raytheon probably sponsors one. They're not letting the other companies get in all on the grift. So we got an uphill battle, but we'll keep fighting it, and hopefully you guys will continue making a whole bunch of progress for us, Hunter. Thanks so much for the work you do, and just tell people real quick everywhere they could follow you in the work you do.
Sure. I encourage anyone who's interested to go to bringourtroopshome.us to learn more about the organization. If you're interested in learning just about Defend the Guard, the legislation we're putting forward, which states have sponsors, which don't, we're just entering the legislative session in the next few months for most states. So the map is in the process of changing right now. But if anyone's interested in that, go to defendtheguard.us. Or if you're interested in becoming a supporter of the organization and you want to join our official supporters group, go to 107club.com. That's TENSEVENCLUB.com. You can join up and become a recurring donor for as little as $10 a month, although I encourage you to give what you're able, because every penny goes to supporting the Defend the Guard movement and making sure that when we have these bills come forward in these state legislatures, when we get hearings, that we're able to get veterans there, we're able to get experts there to testify, we're able to lobby these legislators and make sure to get them on our side. So I encourage people to do that. 10-7 refers to October 7th, 2001, when boots officially hit the ground in Afghanistan and launched the global war on terror. So it's sort of in remembrance for the people who have served overseas and why we're working so hard to get this done. So I encourage people to become a member of that. And if you're interested in following my work, you can follow me on Twitter at Hunter DeRensis, HunterDerensis, or go to hunterderensis.com, where I have a very poorly put together website where I just link all the articles I write if you just want to look at that. But thank you, Kyle, so much for having me on. I really enjoyed myself. And I encourage your listeners to go and read the whole piece, because I think, despite its length, it's a long one, but I think they'll find it very worthwhile.
Yeah, it's definitely worth it. And make it till the end, because that's where you got the good stuff on the current situation, too. So even if you got to bookmark it, put it down, come back to it, it's definitely worth it to get through the whole article. Hunter, thank you. And we'll have to do this again next time you write an article.
Looking forward to it, Kyle. Thank you.